The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the cries of the dying. Zhang Chenggang, also known as Koxinga, stood atop a hill overlooking the Dutch fort on Formosa. His eyes, fierce and determined, scanned the scene of chaos below. The once impregnable Dutch stronghold was now a smoldering ruin, its walls breached and its defenders scattered. The year was 1662, and the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, had just suffered a devastating blow in the South China Sea. For decades, the VOC had dominated the trade routes and ports of Asia, building a vast commercial empire that stretched from the Spice Islands to the shores of Japan. But now, their grip was slipping. The loss of Formosa was more than just a military defeat. It was a symbolic crack in the armor of Dutch supremacy. The company's carefully crafted network of trade and influence was starting to unravel, and new players were emerging to challenge their dominance. In Europe, the English and French were flexing their muscles, eager to carve out their own slices of the lucrative Asian market. King Charles II of England, recognizing the potential of the East India Company, EIC, had granted it unprecedented powers. The EIC could now conduct diplomacy, wage war, and even claim territory. This newfound authority allowed the English to establish strongholds in places like Bombay and Bengal, rich sources of textiles, cotton, and silk. At the same time, the French, under the guidance of King Louis XIV and his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, were setting up their own trading posts, determined to break the Dutch monopoly. The VOC, under the leadership of figures like Governor-General Jan van Goens and his successor, Joan Mattheswycker, fought back with all their might. They used their military prowess to expel the English from key ports like Makassar and Sumatra, and they formed alliances with local rulers to secure their interests. But the costs of maintaining this dominance were staggering. Wars drained the company's coffers, and the loss of Formosa meant that the VOC's trade with China and Japan was severely disrupted. The Japanese, under the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, began to restrict the export of gold and silver, forcing the VOC to rely on more expensive and unreliable sources of precious metals from places like Mexico. While the Dutch fought to maintain their grip on the East Indies, their missionaries were spreading the Calvinist faith across their territories. In Ceylon, the Reformed Church had replaced the Portuguese Catholics, and ministers like Philip Baldeus were setting up schools and churches along the coast. In the East Indies, Batavia and Amboina became centers of Calvinist activity, with ministers and lay officers working to convert the local populations. Even in the remote Cape of Good Hope, where the Dutch had established a colony in 1652, efforts were underway to bring the Reformed faith to the indigenous Khoi people and the enslaved laborers who had been brought there from other parts of Africa and South Asia. But the journey of the VOC was far from smooth. The loss of Formosa, the relentless competition from the English and French, and the increasing costs of maintaining their empire all posed significant challenges. As the 17th century drew to a close, the VOC's directors in the Netherlands and their governors in Asia were faced with the daunting task of reassessing their long-term objectives and finding new ways to secure their place in the ever-changing world of global trade. The air over Formosa was still thick with smoke, but the winds of change were blowing across the entire Dutch Empire. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the world of the VOC would never be the same again. The West India Company, YC, faced many challenges and changes during the late 1600s and 1700s. Its main focus was on developing plantations along the northeastern coast of South America and trading goods between Africa and the Caribbean. Dutch planters moved into areas like Suriname, Berbice, Essequibo, Demerara, and Pomeroon to grow sugar, which was very profitable. By 1714, Suriname had 171 sugar plantations, and by 1740, it had over 500. The WIC also traded slaves and gold from West Africa, sending about 16 ships per year between 1674 and 1734. The WIC had a special deal called the Asiento, which allowed it to ship slaves to Spanish-American ports. This deal was very profitable until 1701, when the Spanish king gave it to the French Guinea Company. This was a big blow to the WIC because it lost a lot of money and trade opportunities. The WIC still had some control over slave trading in Suriname and other Dutch colonies, but by 1734, the Dutch government opened up slave trading to all merchants, and the WIC could only compete for a few more years. In Asia, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, also faced changes. The Japanese shogun restricted the export of gold and silver, which made it hard for the VOC to trade in the region. The company tried to use Japanese copper and Bengali silk, but these didn't fully replace the gold and silver. The VOC had to buy silver from more expensive markets, which increased costs. Despite these challenges, the VOC remained profitable, though not as much as before. The company continued to dominate the spice and coffee trade, but faced more competition from the English and French. The VOC also had missions in Asia to spread Calvinist Christianity. They set up schools and seminaries to train local people in Reformed teachings and Dutch language. However, there were many disagreements among the ministers about how to translate religious texts and how to administer sacraments like baptism and communion. These conflicts often distracted from the mission work and caused tension between the ministers and the company. By the 1730s, the Dutch Republic started to decline. The WIC and VOC were struggling, and the Reformed Church's influence was waning. The political situation was unstable with conflicts between supporters of the House of Orange and those who wanted a more democratic government. The Dutch Republic faced invasions and lost some of its colonies, such as in the Caribbean and India, during the 7 Years' War and the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. The Reformed Church, which was a key part of Dutch society, also saw changes. The focus shifted from strict doctrine to heartfelt piety and civic virtue. The number of seminary students decreased, and the church's influence over the population declined. By 1809, the Reformed Church only represented about 55% of the Dutch population. The Dutch Republic finally came to an end in 1795, when French troops invaded and established the Batavian Republic, a democratic government inspired by the French Revolution. The House of Orange could not maintain power, and the Dutch Republic was replaced by a new form of government. In the 1780s and 1790s, the Dutch commercial empire in the Atlantic was also breaking down. The plantations in South America and the Caribbean were still producing sugar and coffee, but profits were falling due to revolts and competition. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War caused significant damage to Dutch colonies, and the WIC was closed down. By the end of the 1700s, only Suriname remained under Dutch control, while the other colonies in the Americas and Africa lost their importance. The Dutch presence in the Caribbean continued, but the influence of the Reformed Church in these areas was minimal. Nicolaas Verburg, the outgoing governor of Formosa, had a lot to say when he wrote his final report to Joan Maetjus-Gakker, the governor-general in Batavia, in March 1654. Verburg was upset about the way the Dutch clergy were handling their mission to convert the native people. He thought it was strange that he, a political figure, was commenting on church matters, but he believed that all Christian leaders should support the church just as the church should support the spread of Christianity. Verburg criticized the ministers for being more interested in their own interests than in the success of the missions. He thought they were too focused on getting the theology exactly right, which was confusing for the people they were trying to convert. He also felt that the ministers were introducing new methods that just made things more complicated. This idea that colonial governors should act as foster fathers of the church might seem unusual, but it was a common belief among the Dutch. Many people think that the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the West India Company, WIC, were only interested in making money and didn't care about religion. However, this isn't entirely true. The leaders of these companies, like Verburg, often saw themselves as having a religious duty to spread Christianity, even if they sometimes clashed with the ministers. The Dutch governors in the colonies were like the mayors and councillors back in the Netherlands. They saw themselves as Christian leaders who had a responsibility to promote the Reformed Church, manage different religious groups, and create a stable society. They had even more power in the colonies than local leaders did in the Netherlands, and they used this power to shape the way religion was practiced. For example, the Dutch governors in Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, worked closely with the church to ensure that the Reformed faith was the main religion. They built churches, supported schools, and made sure that the Reformed Church was the official religion of the colony. At the same time, they had to deal with people from different religious backgrounds like Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. They tried to create a society where these different groups could coexist, but the Reformed Church was always the dominant force. In the Dutch colonies, the governors and the church worked together, even if they didn't always agree. The governors believed that a strong Reformed Church was important for maintaining order and stability. They also thought that converting the native people to Christianity was a good thing, but they had to be careful not to offend other religious groups or cause unrest. The Dutch approach to religion in the colonies was different from that of other European powers. The Spanish and Portuguese often used force to convert people and destroy their sacred sites. The Dutch, on the other hand, tried to blend their religious goals with their commercial interests. They wanted to create a society where the Reformed Church was strong, but they also needed to keep the local people happy, so that trade could continue smoothly. In the end, the Dutch governors saw their role as not just managing a colony, but also as promoting a Christian way of life. This meant working closely with the church, even if it sometimes led to disagreements. The relationship between the governors and the church was complex, but it was an important part of the Dutch colonial system. In the 1600s, when the Dutch started setting up colonies and trading posts around the world, they faced a lot of new challenges. Both the company officials and the Calvinist ministers, who were like the religious leaders of the time, had to deal with issues like slavery, poverty, and social disorder. These problems were complex because the colonies were home to many different groups of people, and everyone had their own customs and beliefs. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the West India Company, WIC, were big trading companies that the Dutch used to control their colonies. They had to find a way to keep things running smoothly, but sometimes the company officials and the ministers didn't agree on how to do it. The officials were more focused on making money and keeping the peace, while the ministers were more concerned with spreading their religious beliefs and helping the poor. One of the biggest issues they faced was how to deal with slavery. Many slaves were freed, but they still had a hard time finding a place in society. There were also a lot of orphans and abandoned women who needed help. The company and the church had to work together to manage these problems, even though they didn't always see eye to eye. Sometimes, the disagreements were just because the people in charge had strong personalities and didn't get along. Despite the disagreements, the church played a crucial role in the Dutch colonies. The Calvinist ministers, along with the church groups they led, helped educate the local people and tried to reduce crime and disorder. They also tried to convert sailors, soldiers, and other company workers to their religion, even though many of these people were known for being rough and not very religious. The way the Dutch thought about their empire was different from other European powers. Spain, Portugal, and France often saw their colonies as extensions of their kingdoms and used religion to justify their rule. The Dutch, on the other hand, saw themselves as a commercial empire that was fighting against the tyranny of the Spanish and Portuguese. They believed in free trade and natural law, which meant that all people should be able to trade freely, and that no single country should have control over the seas. One of the most important Dutch thinkers of this time was Hugo Grotius. He wrote several books that laid out the principles of the Dutch Empire. In one of his works, he argued that the Dutch were justified in taking a Portuguese ship called the Santa Catarina because the Portuguese were violating the natural right of free trade. Grotius believed that the Dutch were helping local rulers who were being oppressed by the Portuguese, and that this was a form of Christian charity. Grotius also believed that once a treaty was made, it should be honored, even if it meant using force to enforce it. This idea was used by the Dutch to justify their actions in places like Banda, where they massacred the local population for breaking a trade agreement. While this might seem contradictory to the idea of free trade, Grotius argued that it was necessary to maintain order and protect the Dutch interests. Grotius's ideas were a mix of commercial and religious principles. He believed that the Dutch had a duty to spread true Christianity, which he saw as different from the Catholicism of the Spanish and Portuguese. He thought that showing kindness and helping oppressed people would make them more open to the Christian message. In the end, the Dutch Empire was built on a combination of commercial interests and religious beliefs. The company and the church had to work together to manage the challenges of running a multi-ethnic, pluralistic society. While there were often conflicts between them, their cooperation was essential for the survival and success of the Dutch colonies. Hugo Grotius, a Dutch legal and political thinker, had a big vision for spreading Christianity through the Dutch trading empire. He wrote a book called On the Truth of the Christian Religion, where he hoped to inspire Dutch sailors and traders to share their faith as they traveled the world. Grotius believed that by spreading Christianity, Dutch sailors could avoid falling into bad habits or being influenced by non-Christian beliefs. He wanted to make sure that the sailors and traders would stay true to their values and not be swayed by the customs of the places they visited. Grotius focused on the basic principles of Christianity that most people could agree on, like the existence of God, the importance of the soul, and the teachings of Jesus. He tried to stay away from complex theological debates that might confuse people or lead to arguments. His goal was to present a simple and universal form of Christianity that could appeal to people of different backgrounds. He believed that living a good and moral life was more important than getting into detailed religious discussions. However, not everyone agreed with Grotius's approach. Some Calvinist leaders like Gisbertus Voetius, Martin Skoke, and André Rivet criticized Grotius, saying that his version of Christianity was too simple and left out important teachings like the Trinity and the sacraments. They accused him of being influenced by a group called the Socinians, who had a more rational and less traditional view of Christianity. Despite these criticisms, Grotius's ideas gained support from many Dutch merchants and traders who saw the value in a broad and inclusive form of Christianity. Grotius also believed that the government should have control over the church rather than the other way around. He thought that religious conflicts could be harmful to society, and that the state should manage religious institutions to keep the peace. This idea was especially important for the Dutch trading companies, which needed to maintain order in their colonies. The companies supported a Protestant Christian order, but did not want the clergy to have too much power. Grotius's ideas became influential in the Dutch trading empire. Writers like Johannes de Laet and Caspar Berlaeus used Grotius's arguments to justify the Dutch right to trade and establish colonies. They argued that the Dutch were bringing commerce and Christianity to new lands, which was a moral and legal right under natural law. This helped the Dutch trading companies, like the VOC, Dutch East India Company, and WIC, Dutch West India Company, to expand their influence and challenge the Spanish and Portuguese empires. As the Dutch trading companies grew, they continued to support the Reformed Church, even if the emphasis on spreading Christianity varied over time. The companies provided funding for churches, schools, and missionaries in their colonies. For example, the VOC supported the work of ministers, teachers, and charity workers in places like the East Indies, South Asia, and the Cape of Good Hope. Even though some company leaders were more enthusiastic about spreading Christianity than others, the companies as a whole remained committed to the Reformed faith. In their colonies, the Dutch companies maintained the Reformed Church as the official religion, but they also had to balance this with the practical needs of governing diverse populations. In some places, like the Cape of Good Hope, they allowed other Christian groups to worship openly, while in others, like New Netherland, only the Reformed Church was officially recognized. The Dutch often respected the religious practices of local rulers, especially in Muslim areas, to avoid conflict. This approach followed the European principle of cuius regio, eius religio, which meant that the ruler of a region determined the official religion. In their efforts to spread Christianity, the Dutch companies faced challenges and had to make compromises. They wanted to promote a general Protestant social order, but also needed to maintain good relationships with non-Christian and Catholic communities. Despite these challenges, the companies continued to support the Reformed Church and its mission, reflecting the enduring importance of Protestant Christianity in the Dutch commercial empire. During the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, faced a tricky balance between maintaining control over religious practices and allowing some level of religious freedom in their colonies. The VOC governors often issued strict rules, but didn't always enforce them unless there were complaints from the local Calvinist community. For example, in Batavia, now Jakarta, the VOC banned all non-Reformed Christian worship, including Buddhist rituals, New Year celebrations, and puppet shows. They called these heathen superstitions, and even equated them with devil worship. However, until 1642, they didn't explicitly ban Islam, though they did try to restrict practices like circumcision and enforce Sabbath rest. In 1642, Governor-General Anthony van Diemen made things even stricter. He declared that only the Reformed Christian religion, taught in the Netherlands, could be practiced in Batavia. Breaking this rule could result in losing your property and being banished. Despite this, the VOC governors often ignored small violations unless the Calvinist church leaders, called consistories, complained a lot. The VOC also had to deal with other religions like Catholicism. In most places, they banned Catholic practices, except in Brazil and Suriname. In Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, they were especially tough on Catholics because the Portuguese, who were still a threat, had converted many locals to Catholicism. The VOC allowed some Buddhist practices to continue because the local kings protected Buddhism. In Brazil, the Dutch West India Company, YC, allowed Catholics to worship because they needed to keep the Portuguese colonists happy. They also let Jews build a synagogue in Recife to attract their business expertise. To keep control over religious matters, the VOC governors had the power to choose, move, and discipline ministers. This was similar to how city governments in the Netherlands controlled religious affairs. The VOC made sure that only approved ministers could serve in their colonies, and they could step in if ministers broke the rules. Many Dutch Calvinists saw trade and empire as a way to spread their religion. They believed that trade was a godly calling, and through it, they could share their faith with people around the world. They saw the success of the VOC and WIC as a sign from God, opening doors for missions and conversions. However, this didn't always sit well with the company officials. There were often conflicts between the religious leaders and the governors. For instance, in 1632, Governor-General Jacques Spex suspended a minister named Justus Hernius for giving a sermon that criticized the governor's control over the church. Spex had a bad relationship with the clergy and didn't like their interference in political matters. Another example is Philip Baldeus, a minister in Ceylon. He clashed with the governor, Ryclof van Goens, over the administration of schools. Baldeus believed that schools were crucial for converting people to Calvinism, but van Goens wanted company officials to supervise them. Baldeus complained to higher authorities, but when no one supported him, he resigned and returned to the Netherlands. These conflicts show that while the VOC and WIC tried to maintain a Protestant identity, they also had to navigate the complex relationships between religious leaders and political authorities. The governors often had to balance strict religious rules with the practical needs of running a colony, leading to ongoing tensions and negotiations. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, and the Dutch West India Company, or WIC, were not just about trade and profit. They were also about spreading the Christian faith, especially the Calvinist branch of Protestantism. However, this mission was often complicated by the human flaws and personal conflicts of the company's employees and clergy. One of the most notable conflicts involved a clergyman named Pieter Apeldoorn. He arrived in Batavia, a major VOC hub, in the 1650s and quickly became a thorn in the side of the local authorities. Apeldoorn didn't like the idea of a civil leader, Governor-General Matthew Jekker, making decisions about church matters. When Matthew sent Apeldoorn to a different post in Amboina, Apeldoorn didn't stay quiet. He accused his colleague, Henricus Hartong, of having wrong beliefs about original sin. The situation got so bad that both men were sent back to the Netherlands in 1654. Apeldoorn kept complaining about the unfair treatment for years. Another example of conflict was between Philip de Vriest and Johannes Roman. In 1692, de Vriest got upset because Roman rolled his eyes and snickered during a sermon. This small incident turned into a long and bitter dispute that even involved the governor, Laurens van Pijl, and the Politiek Raad, the governing council. Eventually, a new governor, Gerrit de Heer, suspended Roman and sent him to Batavia without pay in 1699. But it wasn't just about disagreements. Some clergy behaved in ways that were far from what was expected of church leaders. In 1625, Johannes Anthassoen Doubletrick in Amboina drank heavily and acted disorderly. His wife left him and filed for divorce. In 1633, Johan de Praet in Amboina was caught trading slaves, which was against company rules. Sebastian Dankekertz and his wife were also criticized for engaging in private trade. In 1638, Abraham Routot got drunk and impregnated a woman who wasn't his wife. In 1664, Johannes Nathaniel Dunger in Gala was accused of sexually assaulting women, drinking excessively, and using profane language. The church community in Gao wrote to the Synod of North Holland to report his behavior. In Formosa, in 1637, Johannes Lindesheim was described by his colleagues as living a godless, offensive, and utterly debauched life. He was suspended for being drunk. These incidents show that even in the name of spreading the Christian faith, people sometimes acted in ways that were far from ideal. The tropical environment and the distance from home often brought out the worst in people, leading to complaints of sickness, loneliness, and mistreatment. Despite these personal issues, the company and the church found common ground in regulating marriage and sexuality. They believed that Christian marriage was the foundation of a stable society. In many of the places where the Dutch settled, local customs around marriage and sexuality were very different from European norms. For example, in Formosa, young people experimented with sex freely, and if a woman became pregnant, priestesses would often perform abortions. In Amboina, the Dutch tried to encourage local couples who had been baptized to marry legally, but many refused because they saw it as a heavy burden. The lack of European women in the colonies made it difficult to maintain strict moral standards. Many Dutch men formed relationships with local women, but these were often informal and not recognized by the church. The company and the church tried to encourage these relationships to become legal marriages, but many men were reluctant because they couldn't bring their wives back to Europe. In the Cape of Good Hope, the company actively tried to establish a settler colony by bringing families and encouraging marriage. In other places, like the East Indies, the company was more focused on trade and didn't encourage European families to settle. This led to a lot of informal relationships and a high number of concubines. The company and the church also worked together to address issues like prostitution and the exploitation of local women. They tried to create a more stable and moral society by promoting Christian marriage and regulating sexual behavior. However, this was often easier said than done, as local customs and the lack of European women made it challenging to enforce European norms. Despite the difficulties, some clergy showed exceptional talent and dedication. They learned new languages, adapted to local cultures, and worked hard to spread the Christian faith. Most clergy, though, simply did their best to carry out their duties in challenging and unfamiliar environments. The story of the Dutch colonies is a mix of idealism, human weakness, and the constant effort to balance commercial and religious goals in a complex and diverse world. The Dutch colonial world, though often remembered for its vast wealth and expansive trade networks, also carried a complex and sometimes troubled social landscape. In the East Indies, Ceylon, Brazil, the Cape of Good Hope, and Formosa, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and its religious institutions faced a range of challenges, from managing multi-ethnic societies to addressing the widespread poverty that plagued many of its territories. When the VOC first established its presence in these regions, one of the biggest challenges was the regulation of marriage. The Calvinist Church, through its consistories, was tasked with ensuring that all marriages were between Christians. This was no small feat, especially in places like Batavia, modern-day Jacta, where the population was diverse and included many non-Christians. The clergy there found themselves dealing with a myriad of issues, from couples where only one partner was willing to convert to Christianity, to situations where the woman was already pregnant and the father was nowhere to be found. To bring some order, the consistory in Batavia decided that anyone seeking to marry must first receive training in the Christian faith, be baptized, and then proceed with the marriage. Those who refused to convert were considered foreigners and were not allowed to marry under the colonial government's auspices. As the BOC's influence grew, so did the complexity of its social structures. High-ranking company officers, usually European men, often married European women or Creoles, people of mixed European and indigenous heritage. These families were at the top of the social hierarchy, sending their children back to Europe for education and maintaining strong ties to their homeland. Below them were the criollos and mestizos, who often married within their own groups, but also sometimes with Asians. These middle-tier families were more culturally blended, adopting both European and indigenous traditions. At the bottom were Eurasians and Asians with more indigenous heritage, who faced significant social and economic challenges. Despite the wealth generated by the VOC's commercial activities, many people in the colonial territories lived in poverty. The Calvinist Church, through its diaconates, played a crucial role in addressing this issue. The diaconate, a group of lay people dedicated to charitable work, was a key part of the Church's mission to help the poor. In the Netherlands, diaconates had been established during the Reformation to provide alms, manage orphanages, and oversee almshouses. This model was replicated in the Dutch colonies, where deacons worked under the supervision of the consistory to provide relief to the destitute. In Batavia, the first deacons were appointed in 1621, and they were tasked with helping both church members and non-members. The deacons received funds from various sources, including the VOC, donations from congregants, and legacies left by individuals. They provided immediate assistance to those in need, managed institutions for the poor and orphans, and even offered small loans to settlers. However, the diaconates faced many challenges, especially in the early years. In some remote areas, like the Moluccas, there were no deacons, and charity was managed by merchants or other independent actors. In Formosa, the diaconate was particularly underfunded, and the mission there struggled to establish a strong institutional infrastructure. As the VOC's territories expanded in the 1640s and 1650s, the diaconates had to adapt to the growing needs of the population. In places like Ceylon, the number of Europeans, Asians, and Eurasians increased significantly, leading to more social problems, such as disease, underemployment, and illegitimacy. Governors like Ryclof van Goens in Ceylon recognized the growing burden on the government and reorganized the diaconates to better address these issues. The 1643 church order in Batavia outlined the duties of deacons, including their responsibility for orphans and the management of poorhouses. Deacons were chosen annually and served under the authority of the consistory, providing regular financial reports and working closely with elders and ministers to ensure that assistance was given to those in need. In the end, the diaconates became a vital part of the colonial social structure, blending religious charity with colonial welfare. They provided a safety net for the poor orphans and other vulnerable groups, reflecting the Dutch Calvinist commitment to both faith and social responsibility. Despite the challenges, the diaconates played a crucial role in shaping the multi-ethnic societies of the Dutch colonial world, leaving a lasting legacy of charity and community care.